So we left off with Pitt's strategy for victory. So, and you're good to go over here. All right, cool. So where we left off before, we know that the first 2 years of the war for the British and the colonists against the French was a total disaster. How many battles did they win in the first 2 years? None, right? And they lost their commander, Edward Braddock. They lost a significant amount of their force, and the war is not trending well for them at all. The French pretty much believe that this victory is a foregone conclusion. But as we know, this war is being fought from one side of the Atlantic to the other. And things are going a little bit differently in Europe, but the Secretary of State in Britain, y'all know what the Secretary of State is in charge of? Foreign what? You're on the right path. Foreign affairs. Okay? The new Secretary of State in Britain through Parliament is William Pitt. And William Pitt knows if they lose these colonies, they're going to lose a lot of what? Money, right? So he decides to pump money into the war effort. More soldiers, more guns, more cannons, more horses, reinforcements. His initial nickname was the Great Commoner, but by the time the French and Indian War is over, his nickname will become the Organizer of Victory. So here are the big changes that Pitt made during the war effort to turn the tide of the war on the side of the British and the colonists. He launched major naval assaults on the French West Indies to put pressure on French sugar coming out of the Caribbean. He concentrated forces on Quebec and Montreal because, as we know, these are the two main trade depots for France along the St. Lawrence, and Quebec is the what of New France? The capital. Very good. Excellent job. Quebec is the capital. He also starts to replace the old cautious officers with more like younger and daring officers. He works on getting a larger commitment from colonial militia to try to get buy-in on this. We're actually going to talk about that as we move forward. He also pushed for the Brits to retake Fort Louisbourg or Louisbourg, which was that massive fortress that we talked about before that sits on the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. This is actually the first major victory of the war for the Brits, retaking this fort in 1758. He pushes for them to take Fort Duquesne. Remember, Fort Duquesne is now in present-day what? What city? In Pittsburgh. Very good. And he also pushes them to take Fort Ticonderoga. I don't know if you're familiar with Ticonderoga. It's a fort that's in upstate New York. It sits on the border of New York and Canada near Lake Champlain. Bucket list item. I'd like to get there at some point. I came so close once, but just didn't have enough time. William Pitt will ultimately become the namesake of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Just the more you know. The British commander toward the end of this war is 32-year-old General James Wolfe, dashing, daring, willing to take risks. He's also does a substantial job of bringing in colonial militia to fight alongside him and the British. They are going to launch a very aggressive and also dangerous attack by scaling the defensive cliffs of the Plains of Abraham to attack the French at Quebec. And this will ultimately become the decisive victory that will allow the British to win the French and Indian War. And this will open up the door for British victory in the more global, larger 7 Years' War. However, both James Wolfe and the French commander, Marquis de Montcalm, were both killed in the battle. The French were defeated. Quebec surrenders in 1759, and by 1760, just upriver on the St. Lawrence, Montreal will surrender as well. Interestingly enough, Wolfe is the person that coins the term Yankee. In his war correspondence, he would say, I need so many Yankees from New Hampshire, or I need so many Yankees from Connecticut. And the name kind of stuck. So and sometimes we hear Brits call us Yanks. It's not derogatory, it's been around for a long time. Where are my Yankees fans out there? I know you guys are very excited right now. So, Battle of Quebec, decisive victory of the French and Indian War in America. The war drags out a bit longer in Europe. This will ultimately lead to a peace treaty that will be brokered in Paris that we're going to talk about momentarily. As previously mentioned, Montreal falls in 1760, and in 1759, that year during the French and Indian War becomes known as the Year of Miracles because the tide of the war turned toward the side of Britain and the colonists. So on the left, we have William Pitt. On the right, General James Wolfe. And check it out. That painting makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it? The death of James Wolfe following the Battle of Quebec. There's a reason that I put the year after the Battle of Quebec, 1759. It's not the only Battle of Quebec that you're going to learn about. There'll be another Battle of Quebec that I'm going to teach you about during the American Revolution, but we'll get to that later. So this is the famous Benjamin West painting, The Death of General Wolfe, on the Plains of Abraham, following the British victory in the Battle of Quebec. Questions up to this point? Is everybody good? All right. So the Treaty of Paris. Why did I give you the year on the Treaty of Paris? Yeah, there's a ton of them, right? There's a ton of treaties of Paris. In fact, we're going to learn about another Treaty of Paris at the end of the Revolution. We're going to learn about some other treaties of Paris later in the course. But this Treaty of Paris in 1763 officially ends the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. What were the terms and results? France is kicked out of North America, with the exception of some sugar islands that they're able to keep in the Caribbean, which were quite profitable. Britain got Canada, the Ohio River Valley, and lands far west all the way to the Mississippi. When I'm talking about they got Canada, all right, which will later be divided up into provinces. Britain also received Spanish Florida, but that was just for like a short period of time, because after the Revolution, the next Treaty of Paris will give Florida back to Spain. Florida is kind of a disaster at this period of time, and I'll explain why as we move a little bit farther into the lesson today. France was allowed to retain some small sugar islands, Saint Martinique, Saint Dominique, and Haiti. Those were islands that they maintained, so their sugar production continued. They were also allowed to keep a couple of unfortified inlets in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Has anyone ever heard of Thousand Island before? The dressing, that was one of their inlets that they had. Any Thousand Island dressing fans in the house? No. I feel like you can overdo it with that, you know? So you got it just in moderation. France was also forced to hand over Louisiana to Spain, but that's not going to last long. Spain will ultimately hand that back over to France. France was then supposed to give it back to Spain, but in 1803, we know what happens, right? They sell it to the U.S., Louisiana Purchase. That's why if you go to New Orleans, there's so much cultural flavor going on because it was this roller coaster of like being in Spanish possession, and then French, and then Spanish, and then French, and then U.S., and then you got the African and Cajun and Creole and just all the things going on. If you get the chance, visit New Orleans. Great Britain took its place as the leading naval power in the world. It also had a far greater foothold in North America. I'm going to show you what Britain controlled on this map here momentarily, and it's pretty amazing how much land they got out of this. This also sets the tone for a young Louis XVI, right? Remember him? Last year, he wound up the guillotine. But before that, he wants revenge. And a way in which he will seek revenge is by supporting the Americans during the American Revolution. But that's going to take a lot of convincing, and it's going to take time, and it's a bridge that we'll cross once we get to lesson 6. Any questions up to this point? Is everybody good? Do you guys feel like this is all kind of coming together a little bit? All right. Am I moving too fast? No? Good. All right, cool. This is kind of crazy. Check it out. Everything that is in this like purplish blue, as well as this red striped over the purplish blue, that's all British possession now, as well as Florida. That's a lot of land. Louisiana ends up in Spanish control. Most of the Caribbean is pretty much unchanged. There's not a lot of changes of possession going on in the Caribbean at this period of time. So France manages to maintain control of their most valuable colonies as a result of this, which were their Caribbean sugar colonies. Why does France need a lot of sugar? What do they produce a lot of? Wine. Yeah, I thought that's what you were going to say. Produce a lot of wine, right? So they also produce a lot of other alcoholic beverages, which would require them to have control of a lot of sugar. All right. So the restless colonists, when the war comes to an end, there's celebration, obviously, but it's short-lived, because what you all need to understand is that the colonists have like a totally different identity coming out of this war. And a lot of their identity is more American than British for a variety of reasons. For example, of the 13, how many of those colonies do you think participated in this war and sent militia forces? 2. Anybody else? Anybody else? All of them. All 13. All 13 colonies sent soldiers to fight. So there's a lot more esprit de corps coming out of this because they had not experienced anything this universal before. I guess you could say religiously through the Great Awakening, but militarily, this is a first. Okay. So they start to shatter this sort of like theory and feeling of British invincibility, because a lot of them are like, we fought just as brave and with as much honor and virtue as our British cousins did during this war. So the celebration begins to fade. There's also a lot of friction between British officers and not only just colonists, but also colonial militia, because most British soldiers, but especially British officers, saw the colonists as second-class citizens. You also have the issue of quartering. What does that mean? Yep. They go into the colonial homes. Now, this wasn't always the case. It wasn't like, hey, we're taking over your house. A lot of times it was, hey, we're going to set up an encampment on your farm, or we're going to move into your barn. Why is that offensive to the colonial farmer? They're taking over your land, and that is your livelihood. Okay? The quartering issue is going to get worse as we go forward. There's also a very odd and missed opportunity for the British due to their ego and pride. When this war ends, they would not allow any colonial militia officer to rise above the rank of captain in the British Army. So think of how different things would have been, or even this could have been delayed, had the British set their pride aside and said, hey, George Washington, you fought with valor. We would like to promote you to general in the British Royal Army. And then Washington accepts the appointment. See where I'm going with this? What if they took every single one of the highest ranking colonial militia and said, we're going to promote all of you to the rank of major, colonel, or general? Without a doubt, the American Revolution would have been delayed. But they didn't. There's also this. I want everybody to pay very close attention to this. I want to see if you all know what this means. The British Navy also impressed colonists. Does anybody know what that means? Impressment? Anybody ever heard of it? Okay. Here's the premise of impressment. You're basically kidnapped and forced into service in the Navy. And this is how this often worked. British naval officers would hang around bars in Boston and in Portland and in New York, and then a colonial civilian would come to on a ship. And they're like, hey, welcome to the Navy. Here's a mop. You're at sea. There's nothing you can do about it. Impressment is a huge problem before the Revolution, during the Revolution, after the Revolution. It's actually going to be one of the leading causes that takes us into the War of 1812. Because Britain had a hard time manning their ships. So the way they dealt with it, kidnap people and force them into service. So this was a common issue. A lot of the Americans felt, too, that they had to scrap and survive, and that these British soldiers were just waltzing in and expected to take what they were producing. Does that connect and make sense? This actually creates some other issues. For British soldiers in colonial urban centers, a lot of them didn't really have a whole lot to do, so they would take part-time jobs. Those are colonial jobs. Also, they start dating colonial women. That doesn't go over well either. So this is another issue that leads to offense. There's also the problem with land claims. When the war comes to an end, a lot of British officers receive large land claims, and those land claims are already spoken for, and people are already settled on those tracts of land. The Brits are obviously concerned with the colonists breaking the Navigation Acts and smuggling. Do you think the colonists cared? Absolutely not. They kept on smuggling, and they kept on breaking the navigation laws. That was common. The American militia demanded that they be paid for their service. The debt of the war skyrocketed. A lot of British soldiers could not just be brought back to England. A lot of them were forced to stay put in the colonies as a result of Pontiac's War, as a result of the proclamation of 1763 that we're going to talk about a bit later. As I previously mentioned, since all 13 colonies had a presence in this war, they start to realize they have more in common than they thought before. And we start to see a sense of unity in this post-war era among colonists from different places and different backgrounds. All right, any questions up to this point? All right, cool. So Pontiac's War. Once the French and Indian War ends in America, colonists start to venture west. And the Native Americans, who had had not the best relationship with the French, but a better relationship with the French, were offended by this because now the colonists are like, cool, we fought for and won rights to the Ohio River Valley, now we're going to go south. So they pack up their wagons and they head west. What are they doing? All the offensive things that we've learned about before. They're tapping into their fur trade. Their livestock are roaming around. They're tapping into their hunting grounds. They're tapping into their agricultural resources and other resources. So Pontiac pulls together a group of tribes that you've all learned about. All right? The only tribe that you've not heard of that he pulls into this is his own. Up to this point, you've not heard of the Ottawa. So he pulls together his own tribe, the Ottawa, the Seneca, who we know about, the Lenape Delaware, and the Shawnee. And as I said before, this war is going to stretch from present-day Detroit, Michigan, into Ohio, along the Ohio River, and into Pennsylvania and Virginia. It's happening all over the place. Pontiac and his confederation are going to attack and take over 8 forts, numerous settlements, and at the end of this, anybody want to take a wild guess what the death toll was estimated on the colonial side here?
10,000.
That's high, but it's about 1,000. Okay? But no, I mean, I'm glad you threw a number out there. It's about 1,000. We don't even really know what, we don't have a really, we don't have a good estimate on how many natives were killed in this, but it would have been in the hundreds. So total death toll is probably closer to about 2,000 when you factor in colonists, British soldiers, and Native Americans involved in the conflict. Most of these battles were pretty small, though. They were skirmishes. However, the British tactics got super, super ruthless as the war dragged on, because it drags on for months. So remember, Wolfe is dead. There's a new British commander-in-chief in the colonies. His name, Sir Geoffrey Amherst. Have you all ever heard of Amherst County, Virginia? He's the namesake, or that's the namesake. He's the namesake. He issues an order for his officers to have their soldiers start handing out smallpox-infested blankets to members of the tribe as like a peace, as a peace offering. So now, what do you have pop up again? A smallpox epidemic breaks out, and Pontiac has no choice but to sue for peace. And that'll be it. The war comes to an end, but Britain is still not satisfied. They don't want to keep fighting a Native American war west of Appalachia. They can't afford it. They don't have the manpower for it. Now, if you're wondering about Pontiac's demise, he lives a few more years after the peace settlement, but he ends up actually being killed by a rival tribe outside of Cahokia. Remember Cahokia? We talked about earlier. Yeah. All right. On the left, we have Sir Geoffrey Amherst, and on the right, we have Chief Pontiac. Bum-pa-da-ba. This is where I pumped the brakes today. Sound good? What's up?
What did you say the troops or the tribes that were involved in Pontiac's like?
So his tribe's the Ottawa. The other tribe was the Lenape Delaware, the Seneca, and the Shawnee. And remember, the Shawnee had a lot of power in the Ohio River Valley, especially through West Virginia, Ohio, and into Kentucky. In fact, the word Kentucky is Shawnee for Great Meadow. All right. So, the land-hungry Americans keep on pressing out west, the wagon trains keep rolling. But there's a young king on the scene. His name is King George III. And he came to power in 1760 at the end of the French and Indian War. And he's over it. He doesn't want any more fighting going on in the colonies. He also wants the colonists to get put into check because he's not interested in navigation acts being disobeyed or any other British law against the colonies to be disobeyed either. This, interestingly enough, this royal decree is the first universal colonial law passed in America, because all the other laws that Britain passed along were based from colony to colony. So on October 7th, 1763, the Proclamation of 1763 was issued by George III, which drew an invisible line through Appalachia, and it created a boundary. No more settlement west. And a series of proclamation forts were established through Appalachia. Not far from where I grew up. Has anyone ever heard of Covington, Virginia before? Okay. There's actually a proclamation fort there. They kind of tried to rebuild it, but it didn't really work out. You can visit the site. So, George is expecting the colonists to adhere to this. They just ignore it. It's estimated within the first 2 years of the proclamation being passed into law, 1,000 wagons pushed through Salisbury, North Carolina, through the Cumberland Gap and out west. And there's also a really famous person involved with ignoring the proclamation. Have you guys ever heard of Daniel Boone before? Okay, Daniel Boone, the great pioneer and frontiersman, he established an organization called the Transylvania Company, and it was basically just like a land venture to help people get settled out into Kentucky. The original name of Kentucky, well, there's actually 3 original names of Kentucky. The original name of Kentucky was Transylvania. And then they lobbied for Franklin, they lobbied for Fincastle, and then ultimately it became Kentucky. So people were ignoring it. Daniel Boone goes on to become a militia officer during the American Revolution. And honestly, like, the really important takeaway here is that this is the first domino that's set up that will be knocked down to take us to the revolution. All right? There's also another important takeaway that I want you guys to consider, and that is this. Awesome. Perfect timing. There's your proclamation line right there. What I want you to understand is that the revolution didn't just start because of taxation. There are so many different variables and so many different causes that take us there. And it truly starts here with the Proclamation of 1763. That is all I have for today. Is everybody good? Do you have any questions? All right, there's your proclamation line going through Appalachia. That's where I grew up, right there. And there was a proclamation fort right there on what is now the border of Virginia and West Virginia. All right. That's all I got for you guys. I do have a couple of clips I want to share. And then the rest of the day,